we're not yet hearing the cicadas, we're just seeing their bodies. We'll see if we get to the noisy part of the season. Okay, welcome back, everyone. It's so good to be with you for our third session together. We're continuing exploring in different ways in different text themes around power and humility. In our first session, you may recall, we had that series of, from Massekhet Talmud, we had that series of really interesting text exchanges, imagining Alexander the Great in conversation with the rabbis, Alexander the Great, sort of the ultimate symbol of power. And then the rabbis finding ways to have power, at least in writing, over Alexander the Great through their wit, through their logic. Alexander the Great, they create the story which Alexander the Great goes to an African country of women. And of course, it's the women who somehow outsmart him and send him packing. The one place that Alexander the Great does not manage to conquer is this country of women, thanks to the rabbinic imagination. And I think part of what we were taking away from those texts is different visions of what power might be, subversions to our notions of power in different places. In our second session, we moved from Massekhet Tamid to Massekhet Ta'anid, the Massekhet that deals with questions of how do we face a pandemic, the role of prayer. And we really asked the question, to whose prayer does God listen to? And it turns out it's not always the prayer of the rabbis. That really sort of beautifully and profoundly, the rabbis acknowledge their own sometimes inability to move God, to effect change, that sometimes it's not the prayers of the rabbis, it's not the prayers of the people that you would think would be the most powerful, it's in fact the prayers of the school teacher with a fish pond and the patience to teach children. It's the prayers of Ilfi or Rabbi Ilfi, we're not even sure whether he was a rabbi or not, who makes sure that everyone has what they need, wine for Kiddush on Shabbat and Havdalah. And we were finding that it's actually surprising people that had the power to move God, and it was to their prayers that God really listened. In this session, we're continuing to look at power, although I would say now we're going to be looking at questions of power. What's the right way to wield power? A moment of abuse of power, of not using power, of instead of stepping into our power, sort of leaning back too heavily on humility. And one of the questions we're going to be asking is, what is the right balance between owning and using our power in the right and correct ways? And when are the moments to be humble, to step back, to say, it's actually not my place to decide. So that's where we're going to go. We're moving. We've seen a bit of Massekhet Tamid, Massekhet Ta'anid, and now we're moving to Massekhet Gittin today. Massekhet Gittin is really a Massekhet that's talking about divorce law, talking about a get, but we are not going to be talking about divorce law or a get. I think Ari has already shared the file in the chat, so you can go ahead and open that, but you can also stay with me, and I'm going to go ahead and start screen sharing. And as is our custom, I'll read a bit, stop, and ask you questions in the chat, because I very much want to hear your thoughts, your responses, and questions on these stories that we're reading together. Oh, Ari, it looks like I need screen sharing privileges. Otherwise, you're going to be teaching the class. There we go. Okay. So let me just make it a little bit bigger. Great. So we're going to be looking at the story of Kamtza Bar Kamtza. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, "My dichtiv." What's meant by this quote from Mishle, the book of Proverbs? Ashrei hadam mefached tamid u'machsheh libo yipol bera'ah. What's meant by this pasuk, this verse from Proverbs? Happy is the man who is afraid always, and the one who hardens his heart will fall to wickedness. Akamtza u'bar Kamtza charuv Yerushalayim. As a result of Kamtza, a person named Kamtza, and Bar Kamtza, very similar names. You can hear how this is going to be a story, a bit of mistaken identity, names getting confused. It was on account of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza that Jerusalem was destroyed. It was on account of a rooster and a hen that the king's mountain, Tor Malka, was destroyed. And was on account of Beit Ar, it was on account of a shaft from a chariot, a wooden shaft of a chariot that Beit Ar was destroyed. So we're basically hearing what Massekhet Gittin is going to go into is 3 separate stories where these major events of destruction happened: Jerusalem, King's Mountain, and Beitar, where they were destroyed because of seemingly small things we would have found surprising. A rooster and a hen somehow lead to the destruction of King's Mountain. A shaft from a chariot somehow leads to Beitar. We're not going to go into the 2nd and 3rd story, though if we were to continue with the flow of the Gemara, the Talmud, we would get into that more. But the story we're really going to focus on is this first one, Kamtza and Bar Kamtza Yerushalayim. As a result of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, such a similar name, Jerusalem was destroyed. Before we even get to the story of Kamtza Bar Kamtza, I want to take a minute just to unpack this quote from Mishlei, this quote from Proverbs, happy is the man who lives in fear always, and the one who hardens his heart will fall to wickedness. I'm curious to hear, just turn to the chat. What do you think? 2 things, let's say it this way. What do you think this verse means? How do you understand it? And do you see a relationship between the first part of the verse and the second part? What's the relationship between happy is the man who lives in fear always, and the one who hardens his heart will fall to wickedness? What's the relationship of that? So just go ahead and let's turn to the chat for a moment. So Rosa says, obedience, observance of mitzvot, and disobedience. So maybe Rosa, the first part, happy is the man who lives in fear. This is relating to obedience, the observance of mitzvot, the living in fear, the knowing before whom we stand, observing mitzvot. And disobedience, this hardening of our heart, will lead to wickedness. Deb says, the fear always relates to Hashem. And hardening your heart is when you don't follow in Hashem's way, Pharaoh, right? It's hard not to hear that language of hardening your heart and not think of the ultimate person who hardens his heart, Pharaoh. Of course, we also know even from other texts, there are texts that talk about circumcising our own hearts, that we have to circumcise the part of the hearts that we allow to get hard, to expose our hearts, to allow our hearts to be open and vulnerable and sort of susceptible to. That's a question. What do we want our hearts to be open and exposed to? I'm curious to hear. So Mary writes, Moses was fearful of God. Pharaoh had a hard heart. Moses led the people out, and Pharaoh's people were drowned, right? So thank you, Mary, for making that connection. So that's a really good question. Of both Deb and Mary are saying, who is it we're supposed to be in fear of? It's not just necessarily, you might have read this and been like, I'm not sure how I feel about the idea of Ashrei Adam Mefached Tamid, happy is the one who's afraid always. That doesn't sound to me like a very healthy way to live our lives, but that it's actually a very specific fear. It's a fear of God. And what does fear of God drive us to do? Perhaps to perform mitzvot, perhaps to be better people, perhaps to be aware of the impact of our actions in the world. Mimi says he hardens his heart because he's afraid of being hurt. Ooh, I love this, Mimi. So Mimi, you're really making a connection between the first and second part. Why does the person harden their heart? Because they're afraid. That sometimes we harden our hearts out of fear. That's a really beautiful connection, Mimi. I'll just remind you, I'm getting, a lot of these are coming through for some reason today as private messages, which is totally fine. If you want them to be messages that everyone is seeing, just to remind you to send them to everyone versus just to me so that everyone is getting to read each other's. So Heather says, a question of ego. He who fears is humble, and he who has a hard heart is arrogant. Ah, Heather, that's beautiful. So that the connection between the first and the second half is ego. This is about arrogance versus humility. The one who is, in the first part, we're talking about someone who is humble. That's someone who is fearful, sort of fearful of the impact of their actions, fearful of God, who recognizes authority beside themselves. And the one who hardens their heart doesn't have fear before God. They've hardened their heart, and that might be the person who is arrogant. Wonderful. Okay, there's a lot of other really great comments. So I'm not going to have a chance to read them all. Rochelle says, hardening of the heart to me is when you think you have it all together and feel entitled to take what you think on the road. Right. So again, Rochelle, I think that that's really great that there's this sense of hardening the heart and sort of an arrogance or a sense of entitlement. I think that that's going to be relevant to our story. Jeff says, arrogance leads to bad outcomes. Humility is best. Okay, so one of the things that we're really going to be looking at in the story is who is the character in this story? What is it? What are we trying to cultivate in ourselves when we say Amit? What is that type of fear we want to cultivate in ourselves? When we say, even if you go so far as to say fear of God, what does it really mean if we want to cultivate a fear of God? What is it we want to be afraid of? What is let me put it this way. What is a healthy fear to have in our lives? When is fear, I'm very interested in the question, especially living in the time of the pandemic, when is fear healthy? When does it drive us to be better people? And when is fear unhealthy? When does it not serve us? But here, the idea that actually some amount of fear is really healthy and important to being good people in the world. Okay, so let's go on and feel free to come back to that idea of when is fear healthy and when does fear hurt us? So let's figure it out. Kamtza Bar Kamtza Charu Yisraelim. So going on here, as a result of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, this is going to be a confusing story in terms of names. Jerusalem was destroyed. Let's hear the story. There was a certain man whose friend was named Kamtza and whose enemy was named Bar Kamtza. Literally, quite literally, Bar Kamtza means the son of Kamtza. I don't think in this story that Bar Kamtza is actually the son of Kamtza. There must have been multiple Kamtzas running around. So we have this confusing case where someone has a best friend and an enemy. That's already sort of interesting to think of. I don't know if you ever, like growing up as a kid, like that's not really language we would want to teach our kids to sort of categorize the world into types of people of these people are my enemies and these people are the people. But already you have this very clear division being created of Kamtza, that's the one that I love. Bar Kamtza, that's the one that I hate. So this man, he once made a feast and he said to his servant, Zil aiteli Kamtza. He said, go and bring me Kamtza, my best friend Kamtza. What does a servant do? Aitele Bar Kamtza. The servant brings him Bar Kamtza. So you already sort of have a question there, which is it's not clear from the story. Is it just that the servant gets confused? There's a Kamtza and a Bar Kamtza, and so he accidentally brings Bar Kamtza. Is it possible that the servant is, I don't know, perhaps a little devious, wants to try to, feels like the master is wrong in his treatment of Bar Kamtza, his enemy, and he's trying to either cause up some trouble and see, well, what's going to happen when I bring Bar Kamtza, the enemy? What's the master going to do there? Or perhaps, I don't know, he's hoping that perhaps if I, a less cynical look on the servant is, well, perhaps if I get them in the same room together, maybe something positive happened. Well, maybe he'll realize that he's not his enemy. Whatever it is, the servant shows up with the wrong guy, shows up with the enemy. The man who was hosting the feast came and found Bar Kamtza, his enemy, sitting at the feast. The host said to Bar Kamtza, so a lot of times the Gemara will talk in the third person, but really he's talking about himself. He says, that man is the enemy of that man, meaning that man, me, is the enemy of that man, you. Okay, that's a very nice greeting to your guest at the feast that you're hosting. He continues and he says, what do you want here? Arise and leave. Sort of an amazing question. He says to Bar Kamtza, even if my servant mistakenly came and told you were invited, why would you come anyway? Wouldn't you have known that I would have never in a million years have wanted you to come? Why would you show up? What are you hoping to gain here? You know how I feel about you, get out. It's an interesting question. We don't actually know here what is the source of the enmity. We don't know why the man, interestingly enough, the man is anonymous. We don't know why the man hates Bar Kamtza so much. We don't even know if it's returned. We don't know how Bar Kamtza feels about the man. We just know that the servant mistakenly brings the enemy. And interestingly enough, Bar Kamtza comes. That's also an interesting question. Why does Bar Kamtza show up? You might have imagined that Bar Kamtza would say, first of all, if he really hated the guy, he would have said, I'm never going to his house in a million years. Like, I'm not going. He's also my enemy, but he doesn't do that. You might have imagined that he would say, oh, that must have been a mistake. He would never invite me. I know how he feels about me. But interestingly enough, why does Bar Kamtza show up? What is he looking for? Is he looking for a confrontation? Is he actually hoping for some positive outcome? Is he hoping that the man doesn't feel the way he thought he feel about it? It's interesting that Bar Kamtza comes. What does he come for? I think that that's really important. So let's come back to that. So the man says, the host says, what do you want here? Arise and leave. Bar Kamtza said to him, since I have already come, let me stay and I will give you money for whatever I eat and drink. The host said to him, no, you must leave. Bar Kamtza said to him, I will give you money for half of the feast, just do not send me away. The host said to him, no, you must leave. Bar Kamtza then said to him, I will give you money for the entire feast, just let me say. The host said to him, no, you must leave. It's an interesting, if you imagine, how do you imagine the scene playing out? Is it that Bar Kamtza and the host are having this conversation in hushed tones by the side of the room and no one is overhearing them? Or is it actually very public? If you imagine the dinner party and they're sort of at the center of the dinner party, maybe it started out a little bit quiet, but their voices are escalating. And now everyone at the dinner party is watching this conversation and Bar Kamtza is pleading and saying, come on, I'll pay for my portion. I'll pay for half of it. I'll pay for all of it. And the host keeps insisting and saying, no. I think how you understand the scene playing out sort of affects your reading of the scene. So the host insists over and over and says, no, you must leave. Finally, the host took Bar Kamtza by his hand, stood him up, and took him out. It's not working for the host just to say, what are you doing here? Get out. He actually physically takes him, the host. Now he doesn't even say, have a servant go and do it. He gets his own hands dirty. He takes him and he drags him out to kick this guy, Bar Kamtza, out. That's how strongly he feels. Okay, I want to pause here. I'm curious to hear in the chat, either if you have responses to any of the questions that I raised, what do you think was going on with the servant when he brings Bar Kamtza in the first place? Why do you think Bar Kamtza comes? What do you imagine is the storyline there? What do you imagine is the scene here? Is this playing out very publicly? Why do you think Bar Kamtza in this moment is insisting on staying? Why did he come in the first place? And why is he insisting on staying? Curious to see all of that in the chat, or if you have other thoughts that are coming up. Something that there's more to the story, so we're not done. Don't think this is it. But a question I want to keep coming back to is, who's at fault so far in the story? If we've only read this far, who would you blame? Where do you want to point the finger for the bad behavior? And going back to this opening verse, remember the whole story is somehow going to be related back to Ashrei Adam Mefached Tamid, happy is the man who is afraid always, and the one who hardens his heart will fall into wickedness. Who is the one that is afraid or not afraid in this case? And who is the one that is hardening their heart? Okay, so go ahead, let's put that into the chat. And I'm curious to hear just what's coming up for you on this story. Ah, great, you're already very busy. That's great. Oh, Mary and Jeff, I'm going back to Mary and Jeff's earlier comment. I hadn't seen it yet. 2 doctors here, knowing proper fear prevents stupid complications. Yeah, I do really love that the place of fear can be really important sometimes. I think about that a lot in terms of this pandemic. What is the appropriate amount of fear you need the appropriate amount of fear in the pandemic so that people are taking the proper cautions, and when is fear actually harmful to people that it's too overwhelming. So thank you for that, Mary and Jeff. Okay. So Howard says, I assume, Howard, this is on the question of why does Bar Kamtza come? That Bar Kamtza comes perhaps hoping for reconciliation. I think that's really key. Is if you imagine Bar Kamtza comes to make a show, he's coming because he's like, well, I'm gonna go to that party and I'm gonna cause a scene. You're gonna feel one way about the story. But if you imagine that Bar Kamtza comes because he's like, oh, I finally got an invitation. This is our chance. This is our chance for reconciliation. And then the host is so publicly mean to him and shaming him that really changes the amount of shame and humiliation that Bar Kamtza would feel. If Bar Kamtza is the one whose heart is open and was ready to make up in some way, and the host's heart is closed, it makes the story that much more painful. So Anita says, according to the Talmud, embarrassing someone in public is akin to murder. Hard to think this is a quiet, private interaction. Yeah, so Anita, I think that you're right. I do imagine. So I'll just also read this with Howard's comment, but from what happens later, it's hard to believe it's a private conversation. Bar Kamtza acts as if he was indeed publicly embarrassed. So I think that that's right. I think that this does feel like it's very public. If nothing else, then there's a sense of escalating that when the host drags him out of there, if it started as private, it certainly becomes a public affair. And Anita, I appreciate you pointing out, yeah, the Talmud looks very strongly, Jewish tradition looks very poorly on someone, that to shame someone, to cause the white to drain from someone's face is as if draining the white from someone's face is as if you're taking the blood from them. It's akin to murder. So the amount of shame that the host is placing on Bar Kamtza here is a very big offense. Okay, Rose is saying that Bar Kamtza insists on staying to preserve his dignity. So David, very interesting, says blame the servant. I am curious to hear more. Blame the servant for an innocent mistake, or if there's something more sort of malicious going on with the servant. Anita says, I think the servant made a mistake. Bar Kamtza came because he thought perhaps the host was extending a hand of reconciliation, and the host has hardened his heart. Yeah, painful if you think about it that way, that here the host is the makshel libo, the hardening of his heart. Okay, right now it seems like, so Rochelle says, it's not who is to blame, but who has what part in the incident. So we're going to come back to that, Rochelle. Are we looking to point fingers? Are we looking to say, actually, this really is a dinner party gone awry, and that just step by step by step by step, you could imagine different turns of the story. If the servant had invited the wrong person, if when the host saw that the wrong person had came, the host had a different reaction, you could have prevented the disaster, which is all of Jerusalem being destroyed, and yet everyone we're going to see is going to play a part. Okay, I appreciate all of your comments. Ooh, Ari says they are both hardening their hearts. Interesting, Ari. Do you feel like in this moment, Bar Kamtza is hardening his heart?
Yeah, because he won't leave.
So
they both have staked out their territories.
So that Bar Kamtza is already like really digging in.
Yeah. I mean, whether he's correct, justifiably aggrieved is not the issue. The issue is that he won't back down and just leave. I understand it was a mistake.
Great. A couple more comments and then we're going to go on, even though I see that there's so many, so I'm sorry I'm not reading them all, but that's the beauty of you reading each other's comments. Heather says, on the other hand, the guest's attitude might be so different from the host's that he would spoil the atmosphere of the party, right? Bar Kamtza knows that he's taking a stand and he's ruining things for everyone else. He knows it's public. Perhaps the guest came to embarrass the host. Did Bar Kamtza come for reconciliation, or did he come looking for a fight, knowing that he was going to end up shaming the host? And the host is wrong as he publicly embarrasses the guest, I presume. Arnold says, neither man is willing to talk about the root causes of their rift and talk through their motivations. We don't know why Bar Kamtza is willing to pay for the fees. Arnold, I love this, because you could imagine stopping this at any point and having Bar Kamtza say to the host, why do you hate me so much? Why do you want me to leave? I came hoping for a reunion. I just wanted to come to a dinner party. Or the host saying, explaining a little bit like why he's so insistent. No, you can't stay because last time you did this and this and this and this, and you really humiliated me. But it's like, instead of anyone having a real conversation, as Ari was saying, Bar Kamtza digs in, the host digs in, and then it just escalates really quickly until ultimately we're going to see the result of that escalation. I think to me, this feels something very real about the story. If you think about fights that you've had with people in your life, where perhaps it started out as something small, so much as a mistaken dinner invitation by the servant who's not even relevant to the story, some sort of small mistake, and yet somehow both of them dig in, and it becomes this huge escalation, and yet never do they actually talk about what's going on, what's at the heart of it. So yes, Arnold, I think that's really, really great. Oh, so many great comments. Okay, I'm going to keep going, but please continue your amazing comments in the chat. So let's see where we're at. So the host insists drags Bar Kamtza out and takes him out. And meanwhile, as most of you are saying, we have to imagine whether or not Bar Kamtza came looking for this fight or didn't come looking for this fight. I think we have to imagine that this is pretty public at this point, and that there are other people that are onlookers to what's going on here. So it continues. Bar Kamtza said to himself, sort of have to love the idea of like the soliloquy of Bar Kamtza, wounded, is sitting like thrown out on the back porch and thinking this. He says, Havu yatve Rabbanan velo machube. He said, Shmamina kanichaluhu. He says, the fact that the sages were sitting there and they didn't protest, I can only derive from that, I can only learn from that, that this was, that they didn't care, that this was fine, this was pleasing to him, right? Bar Kamtza, the first thing he says isn't that jerk, the host, who I already know hates me and I am his sworn enemy. That's not what he's so upset about, actually. He's not, the first thing he says is not, that guy threw me out and he's so mean to me. He said, what about all those people who were silent, who did nothing? No one interceded. That's what Bar Kamtza is said about. And that it's not just random people. Who are those people? It's the Rabbanan. It's the rabbis. It's an interesting story. Again, I love these stories. I think that it's so interesting, the Talmud, to think of the meta of rabbis writing stories about themselves. Like, this is a story in which the rabbis don't look great. This is a story in which Bar Kamtza is calling out the rabbis and saying, rabbis, why didn't you do anything? You didn't protest and you let him humiliate me. And yet the rabbis are willing to include that story, which I think is very interesting. Okay, so Bar Kamtza says to himself, since the sages were sitting there and did not protest, although they saw how he humiliated me, learn from that, Shmamina, I learned from that they were fine with that. They were content with it. I will therefore go and inform against them to the king. Talk about a hardening of the heart. If we thought that it was just the host who had hardened his heart, maybe Bar Kamtza came open-hearted, looking for reconciliation. He's now, this whole event has hardened his heart. And what does he want to do? He wants to get, this is the Roman Empire here, he wants to get the sages and the rabbis in trouble. I'm going to go inform on them to the king. He went and he said to the emperor, the Roman emperor, the Jews have rebelled against you over a dinner party. And again, he's not going and informing on the host specifically. He's not saying, how can I get back on the host? It's now his anger is at like the whole Jewish people, at all the rabbis. How can I get all of them not only in trouble, but have their lives be on the line? That's how furious he is. The emperor said to them, who says that this is so? The Bar Kamtza said to him, test them. Send them an offering to be brought in the honor of the government, the Roman government, and see whether they will sacrifice it. Presumably, if the Jews, if the rabbis are still on good terms with the Roman government, send them a sacrifice and they'll sacrifice it. But if they're rebelling against you when you send them a sacrifice, they're not going to sacrifice it. The emperor went and sent with him a 3-year-old calf to sacrifice. While Bar Kamtza was coming with the calf to the temple, he made a blemish on the calf's upper lip. And some say he made a blemish on its eyelids. What's key about this? When the Roman emperor sent the calf, it was a calf that was fitting and appropriate for the Jews to sacrifice. But Bar Kamtza deliberately blemishes, deliberately mars the sacrifice so that when it gets to the rabbis, it won't be fitting or appropriate to be sacrificed. So he's trying to put the rabbis in a hard situation, because on the one hand, they're going to get this offering from the Roman Empire that's, you know, they should really sacrifice it and say thank you. But it's not, it's a blemished animal. So according to the laws of making offerings to God, it's actually not fit to be offered. So Bar Kamtza deliberately creates this situation with this drama. Okay, the sages, so what are they gonna do? What are the rabbis gonna do once they get this blemished animal? The sages thought to sacrifice the animal despite the blemish due to the imperative to maintain peace with the government. So on one hand, they thought, better to sacrifice the animal, even though it violates our halachic code, our legal code, sacrifice a blemished animal, because what's more important? Sacrificing appropriate to God or keeping peace with the Roman government and making sure they don't kill us all? That's more important. That trumps appropriate sacrifices. Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulus said to them, if the priests do that, if they sacrifice this blemished animal, people will say that the blemished animals may be sacrificed as offerings on the altar. Rabbi Zachariah ben Aklos raises an issue and says, well, if we go ahead and start sacrificing blemished animals, the people aren't going to understand why they're doing that, and they're going to think it's now okay to sacrifice blemished animals. The sages then said, okay, so if we're not going to sacrifice the animal, what's our other option? The sages thought to kill Bar Kamtza so that he would not go and speak against them. I just want to flag, like, was there another option that the sages had? Option number one, sacrifice the animal. Rabbi Zachariah ben Aklos says that's not a great idea because then everyone will think you can sacrifice blemished animals. And so number two, it's sort of just amazing to even see these words so close to them. So the sages are like, well, we can't sacrifice the animal. We should kill Bar Kamtza. That's the only other option available to us. The sages thought to kill Bar Kamtza so that he would not go and speak against them. Rabbi Zachariah, same guy who said you can't sacrifice the animal, said to them, if you kill him, people will say that one who makes a blemish on sacrificial animals is to be killed, because the rabbis knew what had happened. They knew that Bar Kamtza was setting them up. Amazingly, if they knew that Bar Kamtza was setting them up, what's a third option? I'm curious to see your third options in the chat, actually. You'll put that in the chat. What Rabbi Zachariah says, these two options, the sages come up with two options. One, sacrifice the animal. Two, kill Bar Kamtza, because clearly they know that Bar Kamtza is trying to set them up. Rabbi Zachariah says both of them aren't good options, because if you kill him, then people are going to say, whoa, this is the punishment for putting a blemish on a sacrificial animal. They know what Bar Kamtza has done. I'm curious to hear if you can figure out, like, well, what's the third option? What should they have done instead? As a result, they did nothing. They couldn't decide what to do. They neither killed Bar Kamtza, nor did they sacrifice the animal. They were sort of paralyzed with indecision. Bar Kamtza's slander was accepted by the authorities, the Roman government, and consequently, the war between the Jews and Romans began. Okay, I want to go to the chat for a second and hear, what do you think of the story so far? What do you think of these options? Can you imagine a third option or a fourth option? What might the sages have done instead? So many options that you all have come up with. Okay, so Rochelle says, tell the emperor what happened. Right, I think that that seems like a possibility. It's interesting that Bar Kamtza has such an intimate relationship with the emperor. Is there anyone else among the rabbis who could have had a relationship with the emperor who could have gone directly? Again, Arnold says, go to the emperor and explain why the animal can't be sacrificed. No one thinks about that. Deb says, find a similar looking animal and switch it. I like that, switcher. That's a good idea. Is there some way that they could have, like, switched it so it looked like they were sacrificing the emperor's animal? Howard says, ask the emperor if he was aware that the animal was blemished when he sent it. Then they could have checked it over and realized that it was in blemish and explained why. Again, Arya is saying the switcheroo here replaced the blemished offering. Anita says, let the Roman government know that Bar Kamtza caused a blemish on the animal, making it not fit for sacrifice, but acknowledging the receipt or asking for a new animal. Anita, that seems like, on the one hand, it's might get Bar Kamtza in trouble. On the other hand, that seems like a very reasonable plan. It feels a little bit surprising that the sages feel like their two options are sacrifice the animal or kill Bar Kamtza. So again, I would say, if the question is either who's to blame in this story, who's at fault, or as Rochelle was putting it, it's not who's at fault, but who played a role in this. The sages are playing a pretty significant role in two ways. One is that they didn't protest when this was all happening in the first place. And two is that one of the sages' go-to solutions was, well, we'll just kill him. Perhaps that's what we should do. Okay, Rosa is saying they should have just sacrificed the animal to save the people. Right, and so here Rabbi Zachariah was so hung up on, well, they're going to start thinking we can sacrifice blemished animals. And Rosa's saying, no, for the sake of pikuach nefesh, saving lives and not starting a massive war, that's what they should have done. Great. Okay, good. So what we see here is that there are some other options. Let's go on and see. Rabbi Yochanan says, the humility of Rabbi Zachariah ben Aklos destroyed our temple, burnt our sanctuary, and exiled us from our land. This is a really hard line to understand. the humility of Rabbi Zachariah ben Akulus. This is Rabbi Zachariah ben Akulus who says, well, we can't do plan A and we can't do plan B, so they do neither plan. And then what happens? Bar Kamtza slander is accepted, and the war starts. Rabbi Yochanan says, as a comment on that, the humility of Rabbi Zachariah ben Akulus destroyed our temple, burned our sanctuary, and exiled us from our land. I'm curious to hear in the chat, how do you understand this? What does it mean here? The humility of Rabbi Zachariah. I mean, I'll just say, anava, which is the same root here, humility, is a really important trait. Those of you that are interested in Jewish ethics and musar, anava, humility, is something we're supposed to constantly be cultivating. We really want to be humble. We want to be humble like Moshe, the most humble man that there was. Humility is the trait that we're trying to cultivate in ourselves. And yet here, humility is being treated very negatively. Rabbi Yochanan said it was actually humility that destroyed the temple, burned the sanctuary, and exiled us from our land. So I'm curious to hear your responses to what is the humility as they're talking about here? How do you understand it? And the second thing that I just want to note is, again, in the question of pointing fingers of who played a part, who's responsible for this, I thought this was a story about Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. As a result of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, Jerusalem was destroyed, that it was Bar Kamtza and Kamtza's fault. I would have thought maybe it was the hosts shaming, right? The hosts embarrassing of Bar Kamtza destroyed our temple, burned our sanctuary. I would have thought the sages' indifference and refusal to help, the sages' willingness to kill Bar Kamtza, destroy our temple, burned our sanctuary, exiled their land. But it's actually none of those things. That's not what Rabbi Yochanan points to. With all the people that Rabbi Yochanan could have blamed in the story and said, this is the issue, this indifference, this senseless hatred, this hardening of the heart, whatever it is, actually the thing that Rabbi Yochanan points to is the humility. That was actually what did us in. Okay, let me hear your thoughts in the chat. So Ari says, there's a time for humility and a time for making hard decisions. I think that that's exactly right. And I think that that's the really hard balance. That it's on one hand, how do we take all these sort of sages' teachings to be humble, to be excessively humble, and yet no, actually, when we are the ones, Rabbi Zachariah ben Akulus, presumably, or the sages, they were in a position of power to make a hard decision. And rather than make the hard decision, they made no decision. They sort of abstained from their power. And as a result of abstaining from their power, the temple was destroyed. Chana says, you need to have the right amount of humility. Too little can let someone else who may not know enough take control of the situation and lead to the wrong decision. Right, Chana, what's interesting here is that, yes, Chana, I think that you're exactly right. You need to have the right amount of humility. Again, this goes back to what Ari was saying, is that sometimes, and this is something that I think about myself, is that, at what point do we actually have to recognize our own power and recognize we are the ones that have the authority to make a decision? It may be a hard decision. We may not want to be responsible for the outcome, but we are actually the right people to make the decision. And there are moments where even our humility, we have to step into our power rather than either abstaining and so no decision is made. And of course, we all know that when you make no decision, it is a decision, or to make no decision and allow someone else to step in and usurp that power. Okay. Well, Mary says, Rabbi Zachariah was too afraid of God to act. Mary, I'm not sure if you're connecting that to the opening quote from Mishlei from Proverbs, happy is the man who is afraid. And what we talked about there is, that's so interesting, Mary. And we talked about there is assuming that what is that fear? Is that's fear of God. And in that opening quote from Mishlei from Proverbs, that was a good thing. Happy is the man who's afraid always. But Mary, I think that you're right, that in this case, it was Rabbi Zachariah's fear was so paralyzing, fear that if we make the wrong decision, fear that then the outcome is going to be that they think we can sacrifice blemished animals, which perhaps the stakes are really high on that one. But still, you would have thought that being killed by the Roman government would be something to be more afraid by. Fear, what will the people think? They'll think that someone who blemishes an animal could be killed. Interestingly enough, the fear that Rabbi Zachariah has is not about being killed by the Roman government. yeah, Mary, I love that on the one hand, Mishle is saying fear is really important. And as both you and Jeff were saying, sometimes healthy fear is really necessary. And yet it's actually Rabbi Zachariah's fear that prevents him from making a decision. Good. So Anita's saying, I'm not seeing how Zachariah's action or lack of action was one of humility. That's exactly the question, Anita. I think that this language here of humility is really surprising in this context of like, in what way is, so I think that the humility here, the way that I understand it is humility and sort of him feeling like, I can't make a decision. I don't have the right information. I'm not the right person to rule on this. And so not making a ruling, sort of stepping back from his power, this was like, as if it was humility, but actually it was irresponsibility. Deb goes back and says, so Deb, so thank you for bringing us back to the opening verse. All of the sages had hardened hearts. Where were they at the feast? Right, at the beginning of the story, we thought it was specifically the host who was Maksha Libo, has hardened his heart. Then Ari said, actually, perhaps it's also Bar Kamtza, but the way Bar Kamtza digs in, certainly then when Bar Kamtza is like, well, I'm going to get them all killed, but also the sages. It's actually a story of a lot of people with hardened hearts. Ria says, this is like the Yertle the turtle story. I love that story so much, Ria, but if you feel like writing a little bit more, I would love to hear in what ways this is like the Yertle the turtle story. That's such a great story. And Anita is just lifting up Mary's comment, which I really appreciate. Okay, so let's go on a little bit with the time that we have. So basically what happens, the Roman authorities sent Nero Caesar against the Jews, the Romans aside. So they see, Bar Kamtza slander is accepted, the war is started, and the Romans send Nero Caesar to go and destroy the Jews. When he came to Jerusalem, he wished to test his fate. Nero Caesar was actually not so quick to destroy the Jews. He didn't think it was a good idea. He shot an arrow to the east, and the arrow fell in Jerusalem. It still fell in Jerusalem. He shot an arrow to the west, and it fell in Jerusalem. So on one hand, he shot an arrow in all four directions to the heavens, and each time the arrow fell in Jerusalem. Nero Caesar was actually a little bit hesitant to destroy Jerusalem. He didn't want to be the one to go against God's city. He knew that there was this God of the Jews that was protecting Jerusalem, and every way he shoots his arrow, it falls in Jerusalem. It's like all signs are pointing to God wants you to destroy Jerusalem, but he doesn't want to be the one responsible for it. He then conducts another test. He said to a child, tell me this random verse that you learned today. And the child says to them, I will lay my vengeance upon Edom by the hand of my people Israel. Edom here is associated with the Romans. And so this random, when he asked the child the random verse, what is the child's random verse telling him? Eventually, vengeance will be laid upon the Romans and it will be executed through the people Israel. And Nero sees in this a warning of, on one hand, it seems like God really wants Jerusalem destroyed because every way he shoots the arrow, it's pointing on Jerusalem. On the other hand, he fears that if I'm the one to destroy Jerusalem, it's going to come back and bite me. Nero said, the Holy One, blessed be he, wishes to destroy his temple. And he wishes to wipe his hands with that man. Again, this is the third person, but he's saying me. He wishes to wipe his hands with that man, with me. If I continue on this mission, I will eventually be punished for having served as God's agent to bring about the destruction. So he fled and became a convert, and ultimately Rabbi Meir descended from him. Nero's like, I want no part in destroying this people and destroying the temple. I know that I'm going to destroy the temple, and then somehow this is going to come back on me. And so I'm not going to be the one to do it. The Gemara cites a teaching. This is our last part. It is taught, Bo or kama gedola kocha shabosha. Come and see how strong is the power of shame. Shehare siya hakadosh baruch hu et bar kamtza, v'yichriv et beito, v'saraf et heichalo. Come see how great is the power of shame that God, the Holy One, was willing to assisted Bar Kamtza, and for Bar Kamtza's sake, because of Bar Kamtza's shame that he felt at the hands of the host, at the hands of the sages who did nothing, God destroyed God's temple and burned God's sanctuary. So again, just thinking about going back to sort of Rochelle was saying all the different hands that had a part in this. There was a lot of hands that had a part in this. You have the servant who either deliberately or didn't deliberately bring this all about. Certainly you have the host, who you would have thought, like, who is really responsible for this? It's the host. Then you have Bar Kamtza digging in and trying to get all the sages killed. Then you have the sages who A, were indifferent in the first place, who didn't protest, and B, who then are like, well, we can either sacrifice the animal or kill Bar Kamtza. You have the humility of Rabbi Zachariah ben Akulus, who is paralyzed by his fear and unable to take action and make a decision. Ironically, it's not Nero. Nero is the one who says, I don't want to be involved in this. I'm converting. And ultimately, who is the one who's really responsible for the destruction of the temple? It seems like the Gemara wants to teach us is none other than God. It was on account of Kamtza Bar Kamtza, but it's actually God, God was so moved by the shame that Bar Kamtza felt that God was willing to destroy God's own temple, God's own sanctuary. So that there's a lot of pieces involved here. Okay, there's a couple other sources we might look at. I'm curious to see sort of overall responses to the story of whole. What do you feel like? What do you feel like the story is teaching us? What is the story teaching us about power? What is it teaching us about humility? What do you feel like is the takeaway from the story that you want to take with you today? So Ria is saying about Yertle the turtle, the story of Yertle the turtle, that all these turtles are really one turtle is climbing on top of all the other turtles because he wants to be the highest. And then it all comes crumbling down. Okay, Howard says, the lesson is the same as in Isaiah. Is this the sacrifice I have chosen? Don't be so rigid about the minutiae of the letter of the law that you lose the spirit of the law and fail to adapt to the human situation before you. Mary says, open your heart to your enemy, right? I think that just in the very language of there being best friends and enemies in the story is already like, that's the recipe for disaster. As soon as you start characterizing the world as, this is my best friend who I would do anything for, and this is my enemy that just when he shows up, how much I will harden my heart. It's like, this is already, when you think about the stories of why was the temple destroyed because of baseless hatred, sinat chinam, you have that here. On the one hand, I'm saying, actually, I don't know what was the problem between Bar Kamtza and the host. Is there some backstory that we're not privy to? But maybe the answer is that there is no backstory. Is that actually either that there is a backstory and it doesn't matter, open your heart to your enemy, as Mary's suggesting, or there isn't a backstory, that it's something stupid and small and senseless, but that they've chosen to live in a world where we say, this is my enemy and this is my friend, this is my love. And the lines are so starkly drawn that's part of the issue. Anita says, it teaches me compassion. Don't humiliate others. Stand up and speak out when someone is being abused. Really, really important lessons. The worrying about the shame of others. Don't humiliate others. Having compassion, to have compassion for Bar Kamtza when he shows up. But not that it's not just about having compassion, but it's actually like standing up when you can protest. Deb says, loving kindness. To soften one's heart. Rhodes says, references the very complicated situation in Israel, the lines that we have, and the lines that sometimes we need to have. Ari says, the rigidity of the rabbis who, instead of sacrificing the blemished calf, brought about the destruction of Jerusalem in the temple. I love that, Ari. When does our own rigidity, our own adherence to, this goes back to Howard's comment, our own adherence to minutia, does it make us miss actually seeing the full picture? We're so focused on some detail that we think is key. We're so rigid and unable to shift something that we actually are not able to see. It actually takes me back to our first text, the Massekhet Tamid, Ezehu Chacham Haroeh Tanolad. Who is the one who is wise, the one who's able to see the outcome, right? On the one hand, Rabbi Zachariah ben Avistrausberg, he is ro'eh tanolad. He's seeing the outcome of, well, if we sacrifice the animal, then they're going to think that we can sacrifice blemished animals, or if we kill him, they're going to think that we can kill people who blemish animals. So he sees the outcome, but he doesn't see the big outcome, which is that if we do nothing, the Romans are going to kill us. He thinks he's seeing the outcome, but he's actually still stuck in sort of the narrow. Great. And Ari says, again, I love this, that the rabbis were willing to share this teaching. Again, I think that's always so important to remember. There's a sense of like the humility of the rabbis in which they show a story in which they don't look good, in which Rabbi Zachariah ben Avistrausberg is being blamed for the destruction of the temple, in which the sages are being blamed for their indifference, in which the sages are contemplating, killing Bar Kamtza, but their willingness to not just point the finger, they're not pointing the finger on their generation and saying, oh, it's all those non-rabbis, it's all those people, they're the problem, but they're actually saying, I don't know, maybe we were the problem here. So many great comments. I can't read, I'm not going to get a chance to read all of them. Rochelle says, understand that you have a role to be influential in situations in which you are involved. Indifference can be powerful too, but don't fetch about the consequences in which you refuse to exercise a potential direction of outcomes. I appreciate that, Rochelle. Understanding the role of influence we might have. Okay, so let's just read. I just want you to see two things quickly inside. One is, there's a comment by the Maharsha, Rabbi Shmuel Adels, on the line, because the rabbis didn't protest. He says, it's possible that they didn't protest because they didn't actually have the power to protest. I think that goes a little bit to Rochelle's comment. Did they not protest because they were either A, indifferent, or B, didn't want to get involved, weren't sure, or did they not protest because they actually thought it's not going to matter if we protest? The host is going to do what the host is going to do and we can't affect it. Are there moments in which we don't protest because we think we don't have the power, but actually we might have the power to influence the outcome and we're not stepping up? The other text that I just want you to see briefly, this is Rabbi Judah Loeb ben Bezalel, the Mahara. He writes, this is so great, he says, remember, it says, on account of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. We don't know anything about Kamtza. Did Kamtza end up showing to the, Kamtza is the friend, the lover. Did Kamtza end up showing up to the party? What happened with Kamtza? Why is Kamtza to blame for Jerusalem to be destroyed? Bar Kamtza, maybe, but why Kamtza? So he says, you have to consider, what did Kamtza do, right? What was his transgression and what was his sin that it said about him? Because of Kamtza, Jerusalem was destroyed. But you have to know that it was because of him. And he was part of the same generation in which there was a baseless hatred and division. And it's human nature that in a place in which there is baseless hatred, one takes for oneself a friend to argue against another that hates him. And this is that which is written, the friend Kamtza, that he's called the friend Kamtza, that love in and of itself becomes a source of division and separation. I think this is a really interesting and powerful line that we think of. Here, love is just being a neutral thing, that Kamtza is neutral, he's the best friend, but actually sometimes love can be used to cut, and love can be used to push other people out, and love can be used to divide. And when we're using love to say, well, this is my friend, my love Kamtza, but that is to say to the exclusion of Bar Kamtza, who I hate, then we're actually using love in a way that is creating boundaries and dividing and really and potential. And he says, this is why the friend is called Kamtza. Kamtza comes from the word to grab a handful of, a kometz, a fist, because the only reason is to join together to divide oneself against others. What's a kamtza? What's a kometz? It's here's the stuff that's on the inside that gets to be together, and then everything else is blocked out and kept on the outside. So why do we call them kamtza? Because we're joining together in friendship, but it's about to the exclusion of other people. Okay, thank you for diving into this rich and long test. I'm gonna stop screen sharing here so we can see our faces, and I'll turn it back over to Ari.
Thank you. As opposed to stories you've done recently, I would say most people have heard of the story, but you took us deeper into the story, and I love the participation and the thoughts of everybody. I suggest everyone go to Google and type in Kamtza, and it goes immediately to Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, and there's like hundreds, just so many things that people have written. So this text is very relevant, obviously, to today. The other texts are a little more obscure. The issues are very relevant, but this particular story is everywhere. So it is a, you know, it strikes very close to us. I think everybody can understand the challenges in it, and I really appreciate you bringing it to us and we're looking at it in a deeper way than most of us have probably studied it before. Particularly the story I don't think I recalled the story about Nero Caesar. Maybe from somewhere else, but so it's a great story. But I do urge you all, go to Google. I'll find some stuff to share as well, but there's just a lot out there. What are we doing next week for the final part in this series?
Our final week, continuing our looks at power, but thinking about power in terms of being in the position of giving tzedakah, and really thinking about the questions of when are we obligated to give, when are we not obligated to give, what questions should we be asking or not asking when a beggar comes to our door, and what does it look like to sustain someone? What's sort of the minimal obligation to sustain someone, and should we actually be doing more than that? And we're going to be looking at that through the lens not of just of like Jewish law, but actually really a series of beautiful stories in which the rabbis are faced with people in need and trying to figure out, well, how do I give and how much, and did I make the right decision?
Well, that's an easy one though, because people are obligated to give to CSP. So you're talking about outside of the CSP context.
Oh, that's clear, Ari.
Right.
That's
Okay.
going to come through very strongly.
Okay. Anyway, thank you, everybody. Thank you for really great group. You guys are intelligent, and you are you have a lot to say, and it adds to this discussion. So thank you all for your insight and your thoughts. Thank you, Rabbi Avi. And I just saw in the news that that the Israelis and Hamas declared a ceasefire during our program. So look what we do. This program brings peace to Middle East. It's as long, you know, as much peace as we can get in that part of the world. But you know, peace is always good, and hopefully we can get into deeper issues over there as well to resolve underlying problems. May it be. So thank you everybody for being with us today, and let's hope that peace holds. And we'll see you soon. It's already Shabbos, guys. Went from Shavuot to Shabbos. I got a lot of work to do. Okay. See you guys later. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Phyllis Gilmore. Good to see you. Bye, Batya. Ed, good to see you as well. Hi, Chris.